Okay, now we can talk about the different kinds of added notes. Essentially, there are two kinds. Since all added notes make seconds with some note or other in the chord, sometimes more than one, the question is, do they make major seconds or minor seconds? Obviously, the diatonic major second is the gentlest one. If you remember example 1 at the end, which went, that's a pretty gentle dissonance. That's one case. A very famous example of that exact added note chord occurs at the end of Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde, when he's talking about eternity. The word is ewig, or Ewigkeit in German, and he wants to give the feeling that you're suspended in time. So the piece ends not with a C major chord, but with a C major chord with an added sixth like that. And that gives you this feeling that it's sort of floating, because it never really resolves, but it just sort of leaves you in the air. So that's a very well-known example from the repertoire. The second kind of added note would be a diatonic minor second, which is, of course, a harsher dissonance. Here's an example, example 8. We'll notice that example 8 in the first two bars has added notes, but they create only major seconds. Only in the last bar do we have a minor second. Listen to the difference between the first bar, added note, major second, second bar, added note, major second, last bar, added note, minor second. So what does it do? It gives you a kind of accent on that last chord, and in this phrase, which is a pretty sort of energetic phrase, it's a nice way of getting a strong accent at the end. Just compare what would happen if, for the last chord, I used a major second added note instead of a minor second. In other words, a gentler dissonance. It makes the cadence rather dull. Here we go. It gives an extra accent to the cadence, and it's appropriate at that point. So that's a pretty common situation. Sometimes you get phrases which mix both. For example, example 9. This is interesting because over a whole phrase, obviously we need to think about where we put each kind of dissonance, but you don't have to necessarily reserve the strong one for the end. For example, in example 9, we're mixing both types, and it just creates a sort of interesting contour to the phrase. It's true that if we keep the same kind of added note all the time, that is to say always a major second or always a minor second, the texture gets rather flat. It gives it more interesting contour if we have, let's say, first chord with a major second, second chord, that's that E, which gives us a minor second. Then the third chord, here we have both a major and a minor second, and the last chord is just major second, so it gives a feeling of resolution. So it makes the interesting phrase, and it gives the phrase a kind of harmonic contour, even with the added notes in every single chord. In other words, every chord has added notes, but the contour is not flat all the time. Now, there are other kinds of added notes. Those were diatonic added notes, diatonic major and minor seconds. Now let's look at something else. Look at example 10A. This is a really common situation where you have a major triad underneath and a minor third on top of it. Look at the second beat of the second bar. That's actually a C major chord, but instead of completing it with an E natural on top, I complete it with an E flat. In this case, notice that the bass line is somewhat chromatic before that. So that kind of prepares us for its sort of gentle minor sound. Here's the same example with the diatonic bass. Notice how it stands out rather differently. Color is more contrasting that way. In the first version, the example you heard, the example is more generally integrated or it blends better together. This is pretty common, perhaps because of the overtone series. You'll often hear the major chord underneath and a minor third on top of it, and it acts like a color note. Just notice that the contrasting, sort of the opposite effect with the minor third on the bottom and the major on top. For example, look at example 10B. Much harsher. I'm now going to play example 10A, but I'm substituting 10B for that second chord on the second beat. Here we go. Much stronger dissonance. Okay, so that's a sort of a summary of how we can do added notes with triads, major seconds and minor seconds. Now, we can also add added notes to seventh chords and ninth and 11th and so on, okay, as we've already seen. One thing to notice, for example, is that if you have a chord that's already dissonant and you add other added notes to it, you very quickly end up with clotting. Let's look at example 11. In example 11, this is a normal dominant seventh chord. If I just have the G on the top, that's just another position of the same thing. But if I add the C, now I have 2 seconds. I have the F and the G and the C and the D. So the chord is getting heavy. So the thing you have to be careful about in both the spacing and the choice of added notes here is clotting. It's very easy to have added note harmony become very heavy and have have a lot of inertia. It doesn't want to go anywhere. It doesn't move easily when you're adding it to already dissonant chords. Okay, doesn't mean they can't be used, but it's rather a strong effect. And this is something we're going to be seeing later on in the course as we talk about even more complex harmonies, because again, the more notes you add, the heavier the harmony becomes, especially if it's not spaced out very widely. And the problem with heavy harmony is it doesn't want to go anywhere. Even playing this chord in example 11, it's already not obvious what the resolution is. Just the seventh chord resolves very easily like that. But what about this? What's the resolution of that? Already harder to tell. And the more seconds you add, the harder it is to determine the resolution. That's what I mean when I say inertia. Okay, another situation you sometimes see is adding with added notes with augmented six chords. We already saw one example of that already. Now let's see another one in example 12. In this case, we're using the augmented six chord in its very strong normal tonal function as a preparation for a dominant chord. In this case, it's as though we're in C major and we have what would normally would be an augmented sixth, would then go to a 1-6-4, and in a normal tonal setting, 5-1. That's not what it does here, but the first chords anyway come from there. So what we've done here is we take the augmented sixth, but now I have added notes. On the second beat, I now have the D and also the E flat in the lower part. Now on the third beat, the D goes away, but I have an F. So now I have A flat, E flat, G flat, C, F, and G flat. So I have E flat, F, and G flat all in the same chord. Now, what does that do? It eventually resolves to that. Okay, so the resolution makes sense, exactly the way a normal augmented sixth chord would make sense. The normal augmented sixth chord would have been written with an F sharp, but I wrote with a G flat because I have an F natural in this chord as well. Okay, so, but the harmonic progression is the same. It's just a crunchier version of the classical progression. However, after that, what I've done is I've kept the added note flavor. First of all, this C major chord has a D in it, which doesn't resolve. Then the second half of the phrase, which is in the strings, has a B flat major chord with an added C on top. Then we have a real seventh chord where the G is a seventh, resolving to F sharp, and the last chord has a ninth, but it's an added note ninth because there's no resolution. So this progression gives you a strong tonal direction at the same time as keeping the added note flavor generally overall present in the phrase. There's one more special case to be discussed in the situation of added notes. That's a special case that Persichetti brings up in his book. And it works like this. We'll see it in example 13. Basically, it's having a bass line that doesn't entirely agree with what's on top. Now, this, if it's an individual chord, if I just had a C major chord with a D flat in the bass, that's an added note, all right, but I don't know where it's going or where it's coming from. But if I make a whole phrase where all the chords have a certain amount of tension with the bass, and if the bass has a real counterpoint, it has an independent line compared to the top part, you can have the impression it's like we have a sort of dissonant counterpoint that's consistent overall. Let's listen to example 13. So as we can see in example 13, if I play just the outer parts together, you can see, it's dissonant most of the time. We'll talk about how the phrase evolves in a second, but the important thing here is the overall quality of the phrase is consistent. They don't sound like wrong notes, and the counterpoint is important. There's so much contrary motion and rhythmic independence between the parts that it's clear they're not just playing the odd wrong note with the harmony on top. Now, let's look at more detail. The first bar is just plain and simple counterpoint. Second bar, we have an arpeggio in the bass over an A diminished chord, or with a B flat chord on top. Then we go down to F, which could be consonant with the bass, A, but then we go to an E minor chord on the next bar, which is dissonant with the A, also dissonant with the D after that. Then we have a C underneath, could be a C7, but it's not behaving like a C7. Last beat of the third bar here gives us what amounts to a ninth chord, but again, it's not treated like a ninth chord. Then we have an E major chord on top and a B major chord underneath. So again, it's almost like two chords in one. This resembles what we're going to be talking about in a lesson or two, polyharmony, but more on that to come at another time. So if I go on now, and now I'm in the fourth bar of the exercise, it seems to resolve onto the E. Notice that what happens then is I have what in traditional harmony would be called a 4-2 chord. Resolution of this chord in normal harmony would be this. However, here it doesn't resolve that way at all. So basically I have two seventh chords here, both of which have E in them, but they're not the same seventh chord. The result is that the last chord in the cadence of this phrase, since it's a plain seventh chord, has a certain relaxation compared to the rest of the phrase with all its contrapuntal activity. Also, the fact that the bass stops moving here, it's an octave leap, but it's still the same note. That contributes also to feeling we've arrived at a point of rest, in other words, the cadence. It's really important to think about these things because, again, an added note is not just a local event. In fact, no kind of harmony is always a local event. You always have to think about how you can make a cadence, how you can make a climax, how can you make contrast. So in each of these examples, that's why it's important to look at how the resource is applied not just locally, but over the whole phrase. In this case, the seventh chord, compared to the added note counterpoint at the beginning, sounds gentler and like a resolution. This kind of texture is best used for a while or as a point of accent. It needs to be consistent for a little while.